Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, Chief Storymaker and your host of this podcast. We share stories for many reasons. We want to persuade, we want to entertain, and we want to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're being perceived by the people you're sharing them with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into lessons from each of those stories. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? Well, when I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, but not to respond necessarily. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your related stories, and think about which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Kevin Strauss, thanks so much for joining me today on my podcast, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will. I'm so glad to have you here. After our last conversation on the phone, I absolutely knew I needed you as a guest on this podcast, partly because we have so much in common in terms of our relationship with the outdoors and nature.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Again.
Again.
So the first thing I always ask my podcast guests is to tell me something about you that most people wouldn't know. You wouldn't find it on your resume or your LinkedIn profile. And the reason that I ask this question is so that our listeners have some connection to you, that some non-work related, very personal connection to you. So it gives them some context for our conversation.
Okay, so something that most people wouldn't know. I guess I'll have to go with a couple years ago, I got into some ballroom dancing, and in my first competition or event, we won second place out of like 30 couples in the international standard, which for beginners, it's waltz and quick step.
Wow, that is so cool. No, I definitely did not know that. That
tends to be a little bit odd or interesting or different, since most people know me as a triathlete and an expedition backpacker. So
wow, ballroom dancing. What got you into that? What made you decide, oh, this is something I want to try?
Well, I've always loved dancing ever since I was little. I mean, I remember in the 70s, dancing to like Elton John, and I remember the song Saturday Night by the Bay City Rollers and Crocodile Rock by Elton John. So I've always loved dancing. And it was a great way to hang out with all the girls, which was awesome. Because most guys don't like dancing. And then one day, a friend of mine who was deep into ballroom dancing, she's like, hey, there's a free class going on down at George Washington University. Do you want to go? And I'm like, okay. And that's how it actually got started, because I'd never done any formal ballroom dancing before that.
Wow. So do you think you were more natural at it because of your athletic coordination?
That definitely helped. The stamina of triathlon definitely helped with dancing. Yeah, and the leg strength, from biking, because and I'll tell you what, man, ballroom dancing is way harder than triathlon. I mean, way, way, way harder than triathlon.
What aspect of it?
Oh my gosh. I mean, in ballroom dancing, in triathlon, all you have to do is kind of go forward, and either you're swimming or biking or running and just breathe, But with ballroom dancing, not only do you have to manage all of what you're doing and do the steps properly and do the choreography and get all the timing right with the music, but then you have to, as the male, you have to lead your partner and give them all the cues and stay tight with them and, not run into people. And I mean, it's so much more complicated. There's so much more going on. Yeah.
Wow.
So
that sounds awesome.
It's mentally tiring as well. It's very mentally tiring.
Well, the reason I asked about coordination is because that's one of the reasons I really don't dance regularly, is because I'm just not coordinated. I can't, I'm not good at memorizing steps, and I'm probably one of the least coordinated musicians you would ever meet in your life.
Right, because you're a musician, yeah.
To the point where I look at people who are musicians who play and sing at the same time. They have an instrument and they're singing at the same time. And I'm just in awe of people
Yeah,
like
how are you
that.
doing that? Yeah.
My husband does that. He plays guitar and sometimes he'll sing with me and he'll do harmonies. And so I sing with one band with a tambourine, and I found that I hit myself so hard on the leg, on the thigh with my tambourine that I leave bruises because I'm trying to be coordinated. I'm trying to, stay on rhythm, and
Funny.
it's kind of stressful. So that's why I asked about coordination. That's really funny.
Yeah, yeah. Well, with rock climbing, I've done a lot of rock climbing in my day, and that definitely takes a lot of balance, and I'm more of a finesse climber than a power climber. It's very mental, so that comes into play. But just feeling the music, and I think I'm actually a pretty feeling person, so that's why the music just kind of moves me there. So
that's great. Love that. Well, that is a good surprise. I really like that as part of our conversation.
Yes,
I think it's going to come up again. I think it'll come up again given our topic.
Sure.
So one of the things we talked about in our first conversation was the disconnect that we as especially Americans seem to have between us and our own human nature and us and nature, the nature around us. And one of the parts of that conversation was when I talked about how people come to the national parks here in Montana and they don't respect the wildness of those parks because they have no context for it. They grow up in these cities and they go to the zoo and look, that buffalo looks so cute, and so they have no context for the fact that these are wild animals that they will attack.
Yeah.
And 2 years ago in Yellowstone National Park, that was all over the news that there were at least 3 bison attacks of people at Yellowstone. And it's because they were taking selfies with them.
Oh, yeah.
They were getting close to these wild animals. So you as a triathlete do a lot of outdoor stuff, but the thing that really piqued my interest was your mountain trekking for days and weeks at a time. So tell me a little bit about that.
About that, like how I got into that, or what it's like, or
how did you get into it, and then what really drives you to continue to do that in terms of your personal development?
Okay, yeah, I think I can definitely answer that question. So what got me into it, when I was way back in like high school, I've always thought it'd be interesting just to pick a direction and start walking, and whatever you happen to come up against, you just dealt with it. I just always thought that was totally like wild and fascinating. I just thought that'd be really cool if you come up to woods, a stream, the mountain, a cliff, and you just got to deal with it because you're just going in a straight line, and that's it. That kind of an adventure just sounded really, really exciting to me. And then I had heard about, so a buddy of mine took me out to Shenandoah National Park because his family had some property adjacent to the park and an old cabin. I mean, it was gross. There was a spider in there one night that was like this big, so we stopped.
For our listeners, that was like 3 inches in diameter.
Oh yeah, it was ginormous. And this is in Virginia, so. But and we started just doing day hikes there, and I just loved being outside. And then his brother took a NOLS course. So NOLS is the National Outdoor Leadership School, and it was founded out of people. It was like an offshoot of Outward Bound, and it was designed more for learning about backcountry living, not as much about finding yourself, which Outward Bound is a little bit of that, a little bit more of that, I think. And I signed up as an adult for this NOLS course, which was like 20 nights sleeping in a tent. And that was really the start, because before that, I had only done a one-nighter by myself with my dog like a month prior. So I'd never really done any kind of backpacking prior to that. And that's what started the whole backcountry backpacking adventure. And we did We did wilderness travel. We did glacial travel. So like mountaineering with ropes and harnesses and pickets and ice axes and all that kind of stuff, crampons, all that. And then we did like a 4-day rock climbing course. So there was a lot going on in that one NOLS course. And I became very, very comfortable because of that course. So, well, this is a little bit of an offshoot, but so what's really cool is on the very first day before we even started walking, we had to share our fears and our apprehensions and what we were concerned about. And one guy had talked about how he had learned about, you've got your safety zone, which is this small little area that you're comfortable with, then your stretch zone, and then your bleep zone. So keep it PG, right?
Not on this show.
And you know, my safety zone was pretty small. My stretch zone was like not much bigger, and everything else was like I'm freaking out. But by the end of that NOLS course, my safety zone was like way past my original oh shit zone, and my stretch zone was way beyond that. And for something to be very like freaking me out, it was going to have to be really like catastrophically bad, like someone just fell off the cliff and we have to do something about it.
Right.
So that was a great learning lesson right there, just getting really comfortable in the backcountry. And really what keeps me going time and again is just how simple and basic life is when you're in the backcountry. Everything that I need in life, I can carry on my back, and it's only about 30 pounds. So, and that's for like multi-week expedition is only 30 pounds, including food and water. So it really puts life into perspective for me and what really matters in life. You know, we've got all these things, stuff, houses and cars and cell phones and all. It's just none of it is necessary at all. You just don't need all this stuff. And the only thing I'm really thinking about in the backcountry is where's my next water supply? You know, where are we going to camp tonight? That's about it. And it just makes life so simple and happy.
There's so much in that in that brief paragraph that you just shared that I kind of want to dig into, especially the safety stretch and oh shit zone.
Oh, we can say that.
Yeah, absolutely. As I tell my kids, there are no bad words, just bad intentions behind them.
Yes,
so we talk a lot about that. Yeah. But that part, oh my gosh, there's so much application in that. And you don't necessarily have to go trekking for 10 days or 20 days or 30 days out in the wilderness.
No, that's a lot.
To stretch yourself like that. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, that's what it took for you. And that's probably what it would take for me to stretch my comfort zone to the extent that yours was stretched, because I have a very big stretch zone.
Yeah.
A lot. And, but it's taken me a while to get to this point. And I think it was singing in a rock band for the first time at 40 that did that. It had the same application for me as that course did for you in terms of, oh my gosh, I can do this. What else can I do?
Yeah, it really opens the doors, like of just going for it, you know, and not being afraid to fail. But that's just something I've learned throughout my life anyway, you know, so.
Yeah. And I think that has more to do with how we see what other people might consider failure. You know, I don't think of the word fail. I always think of the word learn. And I don't think I ever thought in terms of failure, oh, I totally failed that. I have flopped things on many occasions. But I think that's probably part of why you think the way that you do, is that you don't think in terms of, well, that was a failure. It's more, what's next, and how do I adjust as a result of that flop?
Yeah. I do that a lot. I'm constantly thinking about, that's a big thing about triathlon, is, there, you can always improve. No matter what, you can always improve. You can always get better. So it's kind of this like lifelong goal. You'll never quite reach it, but you can always make progress, and you're always learning along the way. And backcountry is the same way. Every time I go out, I'm learning something new, a new piece of gear. How do I like to manage this? I still haven't figured out how much food to bring. I always bring too much. So it's always something to learn, and I love it. I love just learning more. That sounds so cliche, right? But gosh, there's just so much. There's so much in this world, to learn and know. I just want to learn as much as I can, because it's just, I don't know, it's just fun.
Mm-hmm. And I think nature is probably one of our best teachers.
Yeah, yeah, and it's basic, It's just, it doesn't get all complicated with all the other extra stuff. Like overthinking everything. We tend to overthink everything in day-to-day society.
Well, I can tell you one of my friends had a very close bear encounter this summer.
Yeah.
And it was terrifying. And I can tell you that she wasn't thinking about where her phone was at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
There was nothing on her mind but survival. How do I deal with this threat?
Yeah.
And there is a simplicity about nature that in terms of those lessons.
Yeah.
So,
and then when you bring it back into the front country, I mean, not lesson, but something that I learned to appreciate so early on, probably from that Knowles course, is now anytime I go to fill up my water bottle at the faucet, I appreciate it. And this is 20 years. My Knowles course was in 1998. So this is 20 years. Every time I fill up my bottle, because I still prefer drinking out of a bottle, not a baby bottle though, now.
I was just imagining that.
Fill it up, yeah, every time I fill it up, I'm like, that was easy, and I don't have to wait 30 minutes to treat it,
Right. Yeah, I have had a similar experience in recent years, but it has more to do with the fact that I worked for the city, and I went and toured all the facilities when I first started, because I was the first public affairs person for the city. Yeah. And I went to tour all the facilities. And I went to the water treatment facilities. We have two plants here in Helena. And I remember meeting the people, the technicians and the superintendent of the water treatment and wastewater treatment facilities, and building an innate trust with them, and realizing how grateful I was that when I turn on my tap, I know the people who are making sure it's safe for me to drink.
Yeah.
And especially after the Flint, Michigan crisis, which is still continuing.
I was still going on. Yeah. They just shut off all the water fountains in the schools in Detroit. Yeah.
And I look at these people who run our water treatment plants.
Yeah.
And I am so incredibly grateful. I trust them. I know that they want me and my family to be safe when we drink our water and shower and brush our teeth.
And that's a big deal. Well, it's such a big deal because, still 80% of the world does not have enough, food and fresh water on a daily basis. 80% of the world.
Which is just crazy.
Yeah, and I just looked that up recently.
And if you look around you, most people, especially people who have not done any outdoors kinds of adventures, they don't even know where their water comes from. They just turn on the tap. So I think that contributes right directly to our conversation about being disconnected from nature. The people who go to the zoo and that's the first time they see a chicken.
Right.
A live chicken that's not meat in the grocery store.
Not all packaged up.
Right. It's kind of crazy to think about that disconnect.
Yeah. It's just so basic. I love that, and appreciative. And I know that if there was a problem here, I know there's a creek running behind my by my house, so I can go get water there. I have no problem.
And treat it because you have the equipment to treat it.
Right. But, honestly, I mostly just treat my water with bleach.
Really? Oh, so that's what you meant by you pour a little bleach and wait 20 minutes or a half hour or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people use iodine tablets, and that's a 30-minute cycle. But I prefer 2 to 4 drops of bleach, just plain bleach, per liter of water in 30 minutes. and that'll kill everything, and then it'll taste just like tap water because tap water is fluorinated, which or chlorinated, so it's just the same thing.
Right. Huh. We used one of those fancy pumps the last time we went out in backcountry.
Well, and I like those too. I have a filter that you can squeeze water through and you can drink it immediately.
Right.
But for me, that's just a little bit more effort.
Right. Yeah. So. And it's probably, well, I guess it's probably 6 of 1 when it comes to the weight and size of the item that you're bringing in terms of a small bottle of bleach versus, yeah. Well, that's kind of off topic, isn't it?
Well, now people know how to treat their water,
Right.
And honestly, they hand out bleach at to like hurricane victims and things like that to treat water because it's so easy and available. You get anywhere.
Yeah. But the trick is making sure that you know what proportions to use so you don't poison yourself.
Yes, because you can, and it is a carcinogen, so you gotta keep that in mind. All right, we can. Sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay. So that disconnect that we were talking about, I kind of want to go back to that because I think that it also can lead us right back into the conversation about stretching ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
When you go out into the wilderness and you're putting together one of those packs, one of those 30-pound packs, when you're planning that out, I'm assuming that there's a lot of well, I know from just doing limited backpacking that it takes a lot of preparation to make sure that you have everything you need and that it is as lightweight as possible. But when you're planning it, how do you disconnect enough from your regular daily life to be able to plan for that level of detail?
It's really just a matter of picking the location, picking what scene you want to be in, what environment you want to be in, and planning out your goal. I don't know. I don't know if I have a huge disconnect. I just kind of focus on what's the trip going to be, what do I need for that trip, and then just put it together, which kind of clothing, based on weather and so on. It does take time. It definitely takes time, and especially with planning out your food because I plan out every single meal and snack, and there's always a little bit more, but that's it. Because once you hit the trail, it's game on. I mean, when I was in Alaska and we got dropped off, it was me and 2 other guys got dropped off literally in the middle of nowhere. We were like 100 miles north of Arctic Village, which is 10 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And we got dropped off in the middle of nowhere. And the plane left, and it's not like time out, let me go run to the store and get something. Like, no, like that's it, like
Were you nervous or scared?
When that plane left, yeah, it was like reality really hit in fast. But honestly, I did not dwell on it for more than, a minute because you can't, like, that's it. You
just start walking.
Yeah, there's no choice whatsoever. You just have to start living, and then you just have to trust your skills. And my skills were quite strong, being a Knowles graduate, and also being a wilderness first responder. Having that kind of medical emergency training is very comforting to know if there was a medical emergency that I knew how to deal with it. So yeah, but that's one of the things I love about going into the backcountry also, is that you do all your preparation, you get really anal retentive about it and plan it to a T, but then once you hit the trail, it's just game on, and whatever happens, and you just got to deal with it.
Wow. I want to come back to the 2 people that were with you, the 2 men that were with you.
Mm-hmm.
Did you know them well?
No, I did not know them well at all. It was one gentleman who was definitely older than me. I mean, he was like 60 or so. He had always dreamed of doing a trip up in Alaska, and he's a Knowles graduate. And originally we had like 9 or 11 people who wanted to do this trip, But when it all came down to like paying deposits and really committing and taking the time off work and everything, everyone else dropped out. And he was able to, well, he asked his nephew if he wanted to join us, and his nephew was like, sure. And his nephew, a couple years prior, had hiked the entire Appalachian Trail, had through hiked that. And then he kept on walking up into Canada because I guess he didn't have enough time on trail. So he kept on going. So he was very experienced, and he had advanced first aid. And our leader, well, we were all kind of leaders at that point, but the trip initiator, he was a Knowles grad, and he also had his woofer certification. So we were all pretty well experienced, but it was self-guided, and there are no trails up where we were in Alaska in the Brooks Range up in Anwar. There's nothing.
You just use a compass and move.
Your map, your compass, your map, and you know where you want to go. And it's like that whole dream from when I was young of just pick a destination and start going for it.
Wow. Basically it was three strangers, because the guy and his nephew knew each other. But how did that work out in terms of your relationship with them? Did you have time on the plane to visit before you got on the plane? I mean, how did you develop a relationship with them? Was it before you left or while you were on the mountain?
So we had a couple of meetings prior, and in-person meetings, like in New York City, because he was from Connecticut. I don't think I'd ever met his nephew before the trip. And one of the cool things about going on these kinds of trips is I feel like people oftentimes have a certain sort of mentality where they're going to be a little bit easier going, a little bit more agreeable, a little bit more willing to compromise, because you're in this situation together. You may not know each other that well, but you need to get along because you have to rely on each other too, to a point. So going on these kinds of trips with people you don't really know so well can sometimes be a little bit better. Maybe it's sort of like being on that first date best behavior.
Right.
Kind of thing.
Yeah. So, sending your agent.
Yeah. So you're sort of on good behavior. I think the whole time we only got into like one big argument. And that was actually when we were trying to figure out exactly where our food ration was going to be dropped by our bush pilot, because we had to find it.
Right.
And I thought it was on one side of a river, and another person thought it was on the other side of the river. And we got into this big argument over like what side. And this is a big deal because where we were getting our food ration and our raft and rig, you couldn't cross the river there. Like it would be a couple days backtrack hike to where you could cross.
Be able to cross. Wow.
Yeah. So that was a really big argument, like about 6 days into a 21 day adventure.
And how did you resolve it?
I gave in and just was like, all right, you set up this whole trip. We'll just go with what you say and we'll do it. And thankfully, we did. I gave in, thankfully, and I was wrong and he was right. And we ended up on the correct side of the river and we got our food, our raft, and it all worked out very well.
Wow. So talk about a lesson.
Yeah. I mean,
mostly in humility, right? I mean, because you had to, first of all, you had to back down. You had to after feeling extremely passionate about it, probably tired already. So you were probably a little bit irrational. I mean, less than you would have been in a normal circumstance.
Probably.
So you had to back down, which is hard for anyone who is experienced and who has that passionate feeling about something. And intuition. You were probably thinking along a little bit of intuition. So you had to back down, and then you had to, how many days was it before you got to where the pickup point was?
I mean, it was only like another, probably like day and a half.
Okay, so, but that's a day and a half where you had to think, he has to be right.
Yeah,
I hope we're right. I hope we're right.
Yeah.
Do you know if the others, especially the guy and his nephew, do you know if they were worried at that point for that day and a half?
I mean, I'm sure they had some doubt, like, is this really right? But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how much doubt, but I mean, we were both very adamant. Like, we really thought we were right. It was me and,
Right.
and the guy who set up the whole trip, Andy.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah. And
Yeah. Wow. So
I'm so
then you
happy I
get
backed
there.
down, and I'm so happy I
Yeah.
was wrong, and we went with him, and he was right.
So you got there and you're like, dude, thanks for being right. Or you like, what did you say?
I mean,
Did
I
you
don't remember
acknowledge it?
exactly what I said. Oh, I acknowledged it immediately, instantly. I have no problem saying I'm wrong. That doesn't
Hmm.
bother me. It's just like saying if I fail at something, um,
Right.
I have no problem uh, with that. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. I mean, let me get it right the next time. That's all I want.
Right. And
So
and
yeah.
how was your relationship with the rest of the people after that?
Well, it's only one other person, because it was just the three of us.
Oh, right,
Oh,
right.
right, because
Four of you.
everybody else dropped out of the trip. So it ended up
Right.
just being the three of us. And everything was fantastic. I mean, we all got along great. I mean, a couple days in, I had a single person tent and they had a two-person tent, like two and a half. And my tent was leaking daily. I mean, like puddles,
Oh
like
no.
2 feet long and 3 inches wide of puddles on both sides of my tent, inside. Um,
Oh.
so we just scrapped that tent and crammed all three of us into a 2+ person tent, and we slept like
Wow.
that for like 2 weeks. And it was no problem. You just got to make it work. That's just all there
Yeah.
is to it. You just do what you got to do to make it work.
Yeah, because well, and I think about it in two ways. My first thought was how generous of them. How cool is that they cared enough? But the other part of it is if you are miserable or you get sick, they have to deal with those consequences.
Absolutely. We are a team. I mean, there is
Yeah.
no two ways about it. We
No
are a
matter how
team.
well you know each other, how much you like each other,
Exactly. This
you're
is a
all in.
team effort. We're not just dropping someone. That doesn't happen. And again, we were way up on the northern slope in the Brooks Range of Alaska. I mean, we ended up on the banks of the Arctic Ocean. That's where we got picked up by our bush pilot, 3 weeks later. So
Wow.
you have to rely on each other, and that's a big thing too, right? Like, you can't control everything, and well, that's another big thing about nature, right? I mean, you certainly cannot control it. You can't really
Right.
control anything in nature, so you just got to deal with it, and you got to work together, and being on good behavior is always helpful. And by good behavior, it's listening, it's agreeing, it's compromising, it's negotiating,
Hmm.
but it's also having the chance to say your piece, to feel like you're being heard and valued. And I mean, we were like family. I mean, they just like pulled me right into their family. That's how
Hmm.
I felt.
Yeah. Wow. So, how do you apply these things after you've had an event like this? I know I just recently did a blog post and podcast about the after conference hangover, where you're
Oh, yeah,
all,
it's a good one.
thank you, thank
Yeah.
you, where you're all motivated and you come back and then you're like 2 weeks later, you may as well have not gone at all.
Yeah.
How do you address that when you get back from one of these trips? Do you apply things that you did so that you can continue the trip in a metaphorical way? Or I mean, how do you address that? Because I know we just talked about it, coming back from vacation.
Yeah.
How do you not just get sucked right back into your life?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm pretty fortunate, I guess, that things that I learn in life, I'm really good at applying down the road. Um, Again, there's just so much appreciation for being able to do those kinds of activities and successfully. Um, just incorporating it as much as possible without even trying, really. I mean, I can't help. There's such profound experiences when you spend 3 weeks getting water out of a creek, and believe me, I've gotten water out of some really nasty sources. Or getting water
Oh,
from a pond, or pooping on the side of a mountain, and using jagged rocks as your toilet paper because you didn't bring
oh,
toilet paper because you don't. Who wants to carry toilet paper for 3 weeks? Um, It's just one more thing you don't really need. So then when I get back into the front country, I know we think we need it, but we don't. I wrote a whole blog post just like a week or two ago about all the different natural toilet paper, how to wipe your butt when you're
Oh, you're going to have to send me a link to that so I can include
yeah.
it in the blog post with this podcast.
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah, I'll sure do that. But yeah, just being able to fill up your bottle and just to be able to sit on a toilet is so comfortable and easy.
It's a luxury, really.
It is. It is. It's so easy. So I just happen to be very aware and conscious of all these things that I experience in the backcountry and just incorporate them directly into my life. It's funny, when I was rock climbing a lot, and I rock climb, 2-3 times a week for over 10 years, I'd be rounding a corner in a building and I might grab onto that corner of the wall and I'll wrap my thumb. Well, I guess you can't see that, but I'll wrap my thumb just like you would to get extra grip on a very tiny hold when rock climbing. It's just these things sort of just naturally get incorporated into my life, and you just use them. Just use what you got.
That makes so much sense. And the reason I say that is that when I started more avidly fly fishing, when we moved to Montana, my husband taught me to fly fish on the East Coast, in the Susquehanna and the Delaware and the Potomac. And when we got here, I started looking at nature in a totally different way. And the way I applied that was, I'd be looking at the bugs on the river. And I'd be looking at the different textures in the water to figure out where the seam was, where are the fish hanging out, waiting for things to come down through the faster water, and where the deep pools, where the bigger fish are going to be hanging out. But mostly it was about the bugs, because we had to figure out what they were eating if we were going to put something to emulate that on the end of our tippet, on our fly, or on our fly rod. So I remember that as a kid, hating bugs. I mean, really not just hating them, but being uncomfortable, and particularly spiders. And I still get a little prickly about spiders, but everything changed when I started looking at them in terms of the ecosystem and the fish eating them. And I remember kind of over the course of a few years changing in terms of how I saw bugs and the natural environment around me as a result of spending time in the water fly fishing.
Yeah. And it's a whole new perspective. It just gives you a whole different perspective. And then you incorporate that into your life now, and it's just more information available to you at your fingertips, and you can work with it and do with it what you need to do with it.
Yeah, especially in terms of applying it to your relationships with other humans, which is so important. That whole gratitude mindset,
right,
changes your relationships as well.
Yeah.
And so I want to kind of wrap this up a little bit, but my first thought was, if someone was really fascinated by this conversation and wanted to dip their toe into that kind of wild exploration, and backpacking in particular, where would you recommend they go? And I mean dip a toe. We're talking about people who have never done an overnight in a tent, much less 3 days away. But how would they dip their toe?
If someone just wanted to experience the nature, you mean, and just kind of get outside that way?
More wild than that, because my recommendation is always find a place where you can hike through trees and nature. And I'm not talking Central Park, even though that is a beautiful place to reconnect with nature to a certain extent.
Right, but something
I'm talking about
more,
a natural park where there are trails. But
absolutely.
But what if you wanted to go overnight and you wanted to actually try almost like a survival thing, but just dipping your toe into it?
Definitely the national parks and national forests all around the country, in the US, there's so many. You can definitely be out there, and it doesn't have to be a big hike. If you walk 2 or 3 miles from the parking lot, you're out there, and that's an hour, that's like an hour of hiking, maybe a little hour and a half of hiking. So yeah, national parks are great. If you really want to start, just on day hikes, state parks are fantastic. But the national parks and the national forests all around the country, I still use those all the time,
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, they're spectacular.
They are.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, here where we live in Helena, Montana, we are right between Glacier National Park and Yellowstone National Park.
Yeah, so you get some really nice
yeah,
ones out there.
we do. But what's funny is that we don't go into those parks very often because we have wild land all around us. So we go to the Bob Marshall Wilderness, which
Right.
is it's kind of at the edge of Glacier National Park, and we went backpacking in for a couple nights, about 6 miles in what's called the Scapegoat Wilderness area within the Bob Marshall. So we don't go to those parks very often anymore because we know where we can go that's not a park.
Yeah.
And it'll be less busy or less well known. But
yeah.
I would totally agree with you that visiting our national parks would be a great place to start.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
If you ever wanted to go to Yellowstone National Park, my recommendation is to go in mid to late October. Or February, March. If you're there in the summertime, you're going to get stuck in long lines of traffic. And it's not going to be nearly the wilderness that you are craving, or that you, even if you're not craving it, but you know that it's an experience that's necessary and important, I would definitely say go in October.
That sounds
to Yellowstone
awesome.
National Park. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
And the animals start to come down a little bit. They're pretty high up in the summertime when it's hot down low. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. And I haven't been to either of those parks, surprisingly. So I need to get out there.
Oh, well, you should come visit. So I'm going to, I will have a blog post associated with this podcast. And so I'll be able to link to your LinkedIn profile and some of the other information you have. There are a couple of things that I'd like to hear about before we wrap up. And one is, will you please send me links to resources for backpacking and wilderness hikes that you might have, in terms of how do you get started, what kind of guides you might look for, what kind of equipment, people that really have never done it before. How do you walk into an REI, say, I'm going to do this, and then ask them to help you outfit yourself? Or my guess is that you have some resources that you can share in that blog post.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share. I think a lot of it's actually from my head, but I'd be happy to share that kind of information. And there's groups, and meetup groups in your local area is a great way to get started. And meeting people like-minded or who are interested, that want to take beginners out and things like that.
Right. Excellent.
So,
Thank you for that. And before we go, the reason we started this conversation about connecting with nature is because of your work with the e-journal, the family e-journal that you started. And can you just briefly kind of describe what that is for me?
Yeah, so a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, so I kind of had this epiphany a long time back that I really believe people are yearning to feel closer to other people, not to everyone, but to the people who matter most to them. And I was trying to think, like, how can I help people get that closeness that they really desire? And that closeness also includes really feeling heard and valued by the people that matter to you, and valuing them and hearing them. And I came up with this, being an engineer, or schooling as an engineer, I came up with a solution that allows people to share their perspective on all manner of topics through prompted questions from our website. And they get to answer those questions, and their group members get to read their answers, and they get to read the other person's answers. So you answer a set of questions, and you share them with your group members, and they answer the same questions, and they share their answers with you. And that's what Family eJournal is all about. And the questions are designed to just really discuss all kinds of topics that aren't normally discussed in regular conversation around the house, but go a little bit deeper, but are not so profoundly deep, and you're not sharing all your secrets and that kind of thing. It's just to help people to really share their thoughts and their feelings on the world that they live in. And that's what Family eJournal is all about, is sharing your perspective and hearing the perspective of the people that matter most to you. And it's all private. It's all done online. It's all using the written word. And a lot of times the written word is actually even more powerful than the spoken word. And, you tend to say things in writing that you may not want to say or share verbally, but it also gives you time to articulate in writing.
And process.
And process, exactly, because when you're reading somebody else's e-journal, you can hear their voice in your head, and you really get their perspective, their point of view. And that actually helps bring you closer together. When you're sharing comparable kinds of information to a comparable level of depth or intimacy, that brings you closer together. And we've even done research with Family eJournal showing that it improves relationships and the feeling of connection, because it's just about sharing. It's not just about, in the house, like, what's your schedule? When are you going to be home from school? How was your day how was your work day? How was your school day? And how often do parents really share how their day was going? Oh, I got reamed out by my boss because my presentation wasn't so great. I mean, when does a parent ever really say that? I know my parents never told me that kind of stuff. Those are the kinds of things that you'll have an opportunity to share. But it's also really fun things like your favorite vacation or your favorite childhood memory, those things.
What I like about it is that it reminds me of a few things that I did as a child. My family growing up, we continue to be very, very close. And when I was going through tough times it must have been like 4th, 5th grade or so.
Okay,
and then
yeah,
up
like
into
9,
middle
10 years
school.
old.
Yep. And then into middle school again.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad was in the printing and publishing industry. And so we always had random pads of paper and stacks of different, because leftovers from the slicer, they would sometimes put a little adhesive on the end, and we'd have these little, and I remember for some reason over the course of a few years, we had these bright yellow square pads of paper. And I had one in the bathroom one night. I don't remember why. And I was brushing my teeth, and I wrote a note to my mom, because I knew she was going to go into the bathroom the next morning. And I said something about, I had a good day, thanks for dinner, or something like that. And when I woke up in the morning and I went in to brush my teeth, she had left me a note. And then that night, I left her another note.
Right.
And we did that. I don't know how long, Kevin. It went on for years. I mean, literally years.
Wow.
And they were just little notes. And I have to tell you, my mom and I have always had a very complicated relationship. And I think that's fairly typical for mothers and daughters. And we get very tense moments. And there were times when we really didn't like each other. I know she didn't like me, and I know I didn't like her. But we were always very close emotionally, and she was always there for me. I never had a doubt, ever. And those notes gave us an opportunity to get beyond our emotional face-to-face responses.
Exactly.
So that we knew that we loved each other, even though we bickered continuously. And what's interesting is that it was probably 20 years ago. So our son is going to be 20 in October. So it was a little fewer it was probably 18 years ago. we had moved into this house that we bought, our first house, and my dad had given me these boxes that he had packed from my bedroom in our house 10 years before. He said, these are yours. You have a house now. You get them out of my storage.
Right.
And I take them home, and every once in a while I'd go sit in our garage or next to the garage if it was nice out, haul out one of these huge boxes. It was a big file box.
Yeah.
And I'd start going through, and I'd have these piles, you know, to give away, to throw away, to keep. And I found a huge stack of those yellow notes.
Oh, wow. That's
I
awesome.
had kept them all those years. So the reason your family e-journal, you know, lights me up is that I don't see that happening like it happened in my household. And I do it with my boys periodically, but we don't have anything long term like what we did with those yellow notes.
Right.
But the other thing I love about it is that what it can do is help start conversations when you are sitting together at dinner.
That is it right there.
And it's just one in a set of tools.
Yes.
To remind families how important it is to connect. It's not about whether you're connected. You know, it doesn't matter how close you are with your family. Having another tool to help develop and define those relationships has to be a good thing. It just has to.
Yeah. Just hearing another person's point of view and having a chance to share yours. And again, not just for, you know, parents and kids. It's an amazing tool for couples, you know. I mean, I just had another family join, and they've got 2 little ones that are, you know, less than 3 years old, but they're using it as just couples, you know, because how many couples grow apart, you know, over time,
especially when their kids are little.
Especially, exactly. So it, like you said, it's just another tool. It's a way to get conversations started, and that's why we make it easy, because we prompt you with the questions, so you don't have to think about what am I going to write about. Just answer the simple question, you know, like, what was your favorite, you know, cartoon character growing up, or you know, what's the best thing that happened to you today? I mean, it's those kinds of simple questions that allow you a chance to reflect on your own life and what's going on in your world. And again, hear from the people that matter most to you. Because we can't connect to everyone. That's just not realistic. You can't be tight with your 400 Facebook friends or your 10,000, you know, Instagram followers. Like, that's not what connection is, you know.
And there's a limit to the amount of time you have to spend. And at least I am all about priorities.
Exactly.
Because life is unpredictable.
Yeah, I mean, wow, yeah. You never know.
Right. And that brings me back to using that as a tool to also maybe have those conversations and remember to get outside. And what I find, the reason this just popped into my head is that once you've started these conversations online through the family e-journal, if you can incorporate other things into that communication strategy, which would be taking walks together or taking drives together. What I found is that when I would take a drive with my boys in the car, especially when they were little and still sitting in a booster seat or a car seat. So they're in the back seat and they couldn't see my face, but sometimes I could use my mirror and see theirs. And they would share things with me from the back seat that they wouldn't share with me face to face.
Exactly, because you don't have that face to face.
Exactly.
There's a lot, you know, nonverbal communication is great, but it can also get in the way, you know.
It definitely limits
the eye rolling and the dismissive looks, and you know, that stuff can really get in the way and impede communication and impede connection, which are two things.
And having those prompts that you've been answering over the course of the last few days, weeks, months, gives you an opportunity to use those prompts when you're in the car or taking walks together where you can't necessarily see each other's faces. And then you can dig a little deeper if you need to.
Well, and that's the whole goal too, because with family e-journal and corporate e-journal, which is designed to improve coworker relationships and connection, with those platforms, there's no opportunity to reply or comment on what anybody writes or shares. So
Oh.
you're only sharing out. So if you want to continue the conversation, you need to email them, text them, call them, take a walk with them, and have that conversation. So it really was originally intended to help improve the verbal or face-to-face dialogue, but
Mm-hmm.
it also works, in and of itself, just through the written dialogue. But it can be a great catalyst for those
Mm-hmm.
deeper conversations when you are together.
It's a great use of technology, leveraging the technology to
Exactly.
improve face to face,
Actually, I think
as
I used
opposed
that
to
word.
replacing it.
Yeah, leveraging
Yeah.
technology for connecting authentically.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're doing. We're
Which, of
just using
course,
technology as a tool, not as the end. It's just a
exactly,
start.
exactly, which is so important.
Hmm.
Kevin, this has been a great conversation. We've been kind of all over the place, but it all
Yeah.
comes back full circle to the whole intent of this conversation was to remind people how nature can connect us and how important it is to reconnect with each other and with ourselves.
Hmm.
And whether you're using a backpacking trip in the middle of nowhere or a day hike or even wandering through Central Park together,
Hmm.
um, you're getting out of an office or a house or whatever, being able to be outside where there are trees and green.
Hmm.
And one of my favorite things is to jump from rock to rock when
Hmm.
I'm out on a real hike, outside of the city.
Yeah.
And those things are just so important. And I would just really encourage our listeners to take that next step and step outside.
Yeah. Give it a try. It's wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you, Kevin. I really appreciate you taking the time to visit with me today.
Thank you. It was awesome. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?